Good day, everyone. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 11 entitled The International Monetary System.
The objectives of this chapter is first, describe the historical development of the modern global monetary system. Second is to explain the role played by the World Bank and the MIF in the international monetary system. Third is to compare and contrast the differences between a fixed and a floating exchange rate system. Fourth is to identify exchange rate regimes used in the world today and why countries adopt different exchange rate regimes. Next is to understand the debate surrounding the role of the IMF in the management of financial crisis. And lastly, explain the implications of the global monetary system for currency management and business strategy.
In the ever-evolving landscape of global finance, the international monetary system stands as the backbone that supports the interconnectedness of nations. It serves as the intricate web of agreements, institutions, and mechanisms that govern the exchange of currencies, facilitate international trade, and shape the economic relationships between countries. International monetary system is just like a symphony of currencies where each nation's monetary unit plays a unique role in the grand composition. Just like musical notes, each nation's monetary unit adds its own distinctive melody to the composition, creating a vibrant tapestry of economic exchange. Just like a symphony conductor coordinates the orchestra, the international monetary system orchestrates the interactions between nations, facilitating the smooth flow of trade and investment. It also establishes the rules of engagement, allowing currencies to dance freely across borders and harmonizing economic activities on a global scale. At its core, the international monetary system seeks to establish stability and predictability in the realm of currency exchange rates. It provides a framework for nations to determine the value of their currency relative to others, allowing for smooth trade and investment flows. Through mechanisms such as fixed exchange rates, floating exchange rates, or a combination of both, the international monetary system strives to maintain equilibrium amidst the ebb and flow of economic forces. In simple terms, the foreign exchange market or forex is a place where people trade different currencies. It's like a marketplace where you can buy, sell, or exchange one currency for another. This market is huge and operates globally with trillions of dollars being traded every day. The value of currencies is always changing, and that's what makes the forex market interesting. Exchange rates determine how much one currency is worth compared to another, and these rates can go up or down based on various factors like the economy, politics, supply, and demand. On the other hand, a floating exchange rate regime occurs when the value of a country's currency is determined by the market, specifically the foreign exchange market. It's like a free-flowing river where the price of a currency goes up and down based on the supply and demand for that currency compared to other currencies. Instead of the government setting the value of the currency, it is determined by the forces of supply and demand in the market. So next is the peg exchange rate. So it occurs when a country's currency is fixed or pegged to another currency, a basket of currencies, or a specific measure of value such as gold. This means that the value of the currency is set at a fixed rate in relation to the chosen reference currency. So for example, if country A pegs its currency to the US dollar, it means that the value of country A's currency is fixed in relation to the US dollar. If the US dollar strengthens or weakens against other currencies in the foreign exchange market, country A's currency value adjusts accordingly to maintain the peg exchange rate. So, still, other countries have operated with a fixed exchange rate in which the values of a set of currencies are fixed against each other at some mutually agreed on exchange rate. So now, let's proceed to the golden standard. The golden standard was a monetary system where a country's currency was directly linked to a fixed amount of gold. This means that the value of the currency was determined by the fixed price of gold. Under the gold standard, people could exchange their currency for a specific amount of gold. So for example, let's say the price of gold is set at $100 per ounce. So if the fixed price of gold is $100 per ounce, then one could exchange $100 for 1 ounce of gold. Historically, the gold standard was the basis for the international monetary system from the 1870s to the early 1920s, and again from the late 1920s to 1932. It was also in place from 1944 until 1971 when the United States unilaterally terminated convertibility of the US dollar to gold. The great strength claimed for the gold standard was that it contained a powerful mechanism for achieving balance of trade equilibrium by all countries. So in simple terms, balance of trade equilibrium refers to a situation where a country's residents earned the same amount of money from exporting goods and services as they spent on importing goods and services from other countries. So this equilibrium is achieved when the amount of exports is equal to the amount paid for imports. International Monetary Fund or IMF plays two crucial roles in the global economy. It promotes discipline and flexibility. Discipline is an essential aspect of the IMF's work. Through economic surveillance, the IMF closely monitors the economic policies and performance of its member countries. By identifying areas of economic imbalance and potential dangers, the IMF emphasizes the need for countries to address these imbalances and implement sound economic policies. Flexibility is another significant role of the IMF, for it aims to prevent and manage financial crises by providing financial assistance to member countries facing balance of payments difficulties. So the lending programs offered by the IMF are designed to be flexible, allowing for adjustments and modifications as the situation evolves. This flexibility enables countries to implement necessary reforms and restore stability. The roles of discipline and flexibility are interconnected as discipline promotes stability and responsible economic management, while flexibility allows for adaptation and responsiveness to changing circumstances. Next is the role of the World Bank. So when the participants of the Bretton Woods Conference established the World Bank, their primary focus was on reconstructing the war-torn economies of Europe. The initial mission of the World Bank was to provide low-interest loans to help finance the rebuilding of Europe's economy. However, the World Bank's role in this regard was overshadowed by the Marshall Plan, through which the United States directly lent money to European nations for their reconstruction. So as a result, the World Bank shifted its attention to development and began lending money to third world nations. The bank started providing financial assistance to countries that had been physically and financially devastated by the World War II. So this shift in focus allowed World Bank to support the development efforts of underdeveloped nations. So the bank lends money under two schemes. The first was the IBRD scheme, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So the IBRD offers low-interest loans to countries with poor credit ratings or higher risk profiles such as underdeveloped nations. So this scheme allows these countries to access financing for projects that can improve their infrastructure, education, healthcare, and other areas of development. So the other scheme was the IDA, or the International Development Association, which is also part of the World Bank that helps the poorest countries in the world. So the money to fund IDA loans comes from wealthy countries like the United States, Japan, and Germany. So these countries contribute money to the IDA, which is then used to give loans to the poorest nations. So the loans have very low interest rates, and the countries have a long time, which is equivalent to 50 years to pay them back. The collapse of the fixed exchange rate system. So the fixed exchange rate system established at Bretton Woods worked well until the late 1960s but began to show signs of strain. It eventually collapsed in 1973, leading to the adoption of a managed float system. To understand why the system collapsed, it's important to recognize the special role of the US dollar within the system. So the US dollar held a central position in the fixed exchange rate system. It was the only currency that could be converted into gold, and it served as the reference point for other currencies. So any pressure on the US dollar to devalue could have a disruptive impact on the entire system, and that's exactly what happened. So the collapse of the fixed rate system occurred because the US dollar faced a significant pressure to devalue. So this created instability and challenges for the system. So in response, major currencies began to float against each other and countries were free to choose their exchange rate arrangements. So the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system led to the adoption of a managed float system where exchange rates are determined by market forces but with some degree of intervention by central banks to manage excessive volatility. So next is the floating exchange rate regime. So the floating exchange rate regime that followed the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system was formalized in January 1976 during a meeting of IMF members in Jamaica. And this meeting was known as the Jamaica Agreement, which established the rules for the international monetary system that are still in place today. So under the Jamaica Agreement, the system of floating exchange rates was declared acceptable. So this meant that exchange rates would be determined by market forces rather than being fixed or pegged to a specific value. The agreement also led to the abandonment of gold as a reserve asset and increased the total annual IMF quotas, which are the contributions made by member countries to the IMF. The adoption of a floating exchange rate regime allowed currencies to fluctuate freely based on supply and demand in the foreign exchange market, and this system provided more flexibility and allowed countries to adjust their exchange rates in response to economic conditions. Next is the exchange rate since 1973. So since the transition to floating exchange rates in March 1973, exchange rates have generally become more volatile and less predictable compared to the period between 1945 and 1973. So this increased volatility can be attributed to several unexpected shocks to the world monetary system.
As discussed by the previous reporter, in the international monetary system, fixed and floating exchange rate represent two different ways of determining the value of a country's currency in relation to other currency. Both fixed and floating exchange rate systems have their pros and cons, and different countries may choose one over the other based on their economic priorities, level of economic development, and external trade dynamics. Let us now proceed to the case for floating exchange rates. So, there are two elements. The first one is the monetary policy autonomy, and the second one is the trade balance adjustments. Monetary policy autonomy under floating exchange rate refers to the ability of a country's central bank to independently formulate and implement monetary policies without being constrained by the need to maintain a fixed exchange rate. Central banks have the freedom to adjust interest rates based on domestic economic conditions and policy objectives. So they can raise yung mga interest rates para labanan yung inflation or lower them to stimulate economic growth. Many countries with floating exchange rate adopt inflation targeting as a monetary policy framework. This involves setting specific inflation targets and using monetary policy tools to achieve those targets while considering other economic goals. And in floating exchange rate, the exchange rate acts as a buffer against external economic shocks. When faced with economic fluctuations, the exchange rate adjusts, helping the economy absorb the impact without requiring extensive currency interventions. But unlike fixed exchange rate regimes, where maintaining a pegged rate often requires significant foreign exchange reserves and limits monetary policy flexibility, floating exchange rate allow for greater policy independence. Central banks can focus on domestic economic priorities without the constant pressure of defending a specific exchange rate level. So the overall monetary policy autonomy under floating exchange rate provides central banks with more flexibility and agility in responding to economic challenges and pursuing their policy objectives. Let us now proceed to the second element, which is the trade balance adjustments, which occurs through currency value changes that impacts exports and imports. So here is how it generally works. If a country currency depreciate or nagbaba yung value relative to other currencies, its export become cheaper for foreign buyers. So this can lead sa pagtaas ng export as foreign buyers is maghahanap sila ng mga goods that are more affordable. Simultaneously, yung imports naman is magiging relatively more expensive for domestic consumers, potentially reducing yung kanilang imports. Conversely, if yung country naman, country's currency appreciate or nadagdagan yung value, yung export become more expensive for foreign buyers, possibly is ma-reduce yung demand for export. At the same time, yung import is bababa for domestic consumers, which might increase the demand for imports. These currency value changes can influence the trade balance. A depreciation can improve the trade balance by boosting exports and reducing imports, potentially leading to a trade surplus. Conversely, an appreciation can worsen the trade balance by reducing exports and increasing imports, possibly resulting a trade deficit. In a floating exchange rate system, these adjustments happen through market forces of supply and demand for currencies. Factors like economic conditions, interest rates, inflation rates, and geopolitical events can influence currency value changes, thereby impacting trade balances. Overall, in a floating exchange rate system, trade balance adjustments occur dynamically based on market-driven currency value changes and related impacts on export and import competitiveness. Let us now proceed to the case for fixed exchange rates. Fixed exchange rates can provide stability and certainty in international trade and investment. For example, in the price stability, fixed exchange rates can contribute to price stability by reducing currency fluctuations. This stability benefits businesses and consumers by providing predictability in import and export prices, which can lead to more stable inflation rates. Fixed exchange rate also can promote yung mga international trade sa pag-reduce ng mga uncertainty and transaction costs associated with currency fluctuations. Business can plan and price their goods and services more confidently in foreign markets, leading to increased trade volumes. Fixed exchange rate can attract foreign investment by providing a stable economic environment. Investors are more likely to commit capital when they have confidence that their investments won't be eroded by sudden currency devaluations. Under fixed exchange rate, governments and central banks are incentivized to maintain fiscal and monetary discipline to uphold the pegged exchange rate. Yung discipline na yun can lead sa pagbaba ng inflation rate and a much more stable macroeconomic environment. It also can reduce speculative activities in the foreign exchange rate market since there is less opportunity to profit from currency fluctuations. So lastly, fixed exchange rate often involve agreements or arrangements between countries, fostering international cooperation and coordination in economic policies. This can contribute to a smoother international financial relations and crisis management. However, kailangan lagi natin tandaan na yung fixed exchange rate is may mga challenges din, such as yung mga kakailanganin ng strong foreign exchange reserves to defend the peg rate, limited flexibility in responding to economic shocks, and potential conflicts between domestic policy goals and maintaining the fixed rate. Countries considering fixed exchange rate is kailangan nilang i-weigh yung pros and cons ng mabuti bago nila i-adopt yung system na yun. Exchange rate regimes refers to the framework or system that a country uses to determine the value of its currency relative to other currencies. There are several exchange rate regimes and practice, but we will be focusing on the currency boards and pegged exchange rate. So a country may choose and decide for themselves kung anong pipiliin nila na exchange rate regime based sa kanilang economic objectives, inflation rates, trade dynamics, capital flows, and exchange rate stability goals. The choice of regime can have significant implications for economic policy, trade competitiveness, and financial market dynamics. Pegged exchange rates and currency boards are two specific types of exchange rate regimes that countries may adapt in practice. Number one, pegged exchange rates. In a pegged exchange rate system, a country fixes the value of its currency to another currency or a basket of currencies. The central bank intervenes in the foreign exchange market to maintain the exchange rate within a specified band. This regime is used to provide stability and predictability to international trade and finance. Examples of peg exchange rate systems include the Hong Kong dollar pegged to the US dollar and the Danish krone pegged to the euro. On the other hand, currency boards. A currency board is a specific form of a peg exchange rate system where the local currency is fully backed by reserves in a foreign currency, typically a major currency like the US dollar or euro. The central bank of the country maintains a fixed exchange rate by holding sufficient foreign reserves to redeem all domestic currency in circulation. Currency boards are designed to provide a high level of confidence in the stability of local currency and are often used by smaller economies or those with a history of current instability. Example of countries with currency boards includes Hong Kong. That was before transitioning to a link exchange rate system, and Bulgaria, which maintains a currency board pegged to the euro. Both peg exchange rates and currency boards aim to provide stability and reduce exchange rate volatility, but they differ in terms of the degree of flexibility and control that the central bank has over monetary policy and exchange rate adjustments.
So let's continue our report. So crisis management by IMF. The IMF's original function was to provide a pool of money from which member could borrow short-term to adjust their balance of payment position and maintain their exchange rate. So ang gusto sabihin nito is pag may country na dumadaan sa crisis tulad ng Pilipinas, humihiram sila sa World Bank para to balance yung exchange rate natin sa kada lugar. Like tulad sa US, like sobrang taas na ng exchange rate nila. As of now, 56 pesos. So, next. Financial crisis post-Bretton Woods era. Currency crisis occurs when a speculative attack on the exchange value of a currency results in a sharp depreciation in the value of the currency or forces authority to expend large volume of international currency reserves and sharply increase interest rate to defend the prevailing exchange rate. Banking crisis refers to a loss of confidence in banking system that leads to run on banks as individuals and companies withdraw their deposits. And the last one, foreign debt crisis is a situation in which a country cannot service its foreign debt obligation, whether private sector or government debt. So, nasabi ko kanina yung about sa currency crisis na humihiram yung bawat country sa World Bank para mabalance yung exchange rate natin sa bawat lugar. Kasi kung hindi tayo maghiram ng pondo sa World Bank is abang patagal ng patagal is lulubog tayo or magde-depreciate yung value ng pera natin kung wala tayong gagawin. So, next is banking crisis. Banking crisis refers to a loss of confidence in the banking system that leads run on business as individual as company withdraw their deposit. So, tulad ng sabi ko kanina, ah, bawat pag bawat pondo na hinihiram natin is dumadaan sa banking crisis. Like, di sila next na lang. Next slide. Mexican currency crisis of 1995. The Mexican peso have been pegged to the dollar since the early 1980s, when the International Monetary Fund made it a condition for lending money for Mexican government, helped bail country for 1982 crisis. So, natatag itong uh, bill for Mexican government noong 1982. So, para sana purpose, ang purpose nito is para masustain yung economy ng bawat lugar. Then, the next one. The Asian crisis. The financial crisis that erupted across Southeast Asia during the fall of 1997 emerged as the biggest challenge to date for the IMF. Holding the crisis in check required IMF loans to help the shattered economies of Indonesia, Thailand, and South Korea stabilize their currency. In addition, although they did not request IMF loans, the economies of Japan, Malaysia, and Singapore and Philippines also were also hurt by the crisis. So, hindi lang Pilipinas or bansa natin ang nakakaranas ng crisis. Like, nasabi nga dito, tulad ng Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, kahit Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, and sa bansa natin is nakakaranas ng krisis. Para masolusyonan ito, IMF loans ang nakikita nilang paraan para ma-stabilize yung currency sa bawat lugar na dumadaan sa krisis. So, next. The investment bump, excess capacity, the debt bump, expanding imports is nagre-result ito sa malaking utang. Like, tulad sa atin is almost trillions something. So, dahil doon is Pilipinas is lubog na talaga sa utang. So, next. The Asian meltdown. The crisis. The Asian meltdown began in mid-1997 in Thailand when it became clear that several key Thai financial institutions were on the verge of default. These institutions have been borrowing dollars from international at low interest rate and lending Thai baht at higher interest rate to local property developers. However, due to speculative overbuilding, these developers could not sell their commercial and residential property, forcing them to default on their debts obligation. It the Thai financial institution seem increasingly likely to default on their dollar-denominated debt obligations to international banks, sensing the begging of the crisis. Foreign investors fled the Thai stock market, selling their position, converting them into US dollar. So, next. Evaluating the IMF policy prescriptions. Inappropriate policies, moral hazard, lack of accountability, and observation. So, dito tayo mag-focus sa currency management. The current system is a mixed system in which a combination of government intervention and speculative activity can drive the foreign exchange market. Companies engaged in significant foreign exchange activities need to be aware of this and to adjust their foreign exchange transaction accordingly. So, ang government is naisip nila i-combine yung power nila na si government pati uh, si foreign exchange market or sa Pilipinas tawag natin dito si SEC or Security Exchange Commission. So ginagawa na lang yun is para yung economy or currency natin is mag to boost or to help na ma-sustain or hindi siya maglubog sa kasi once na yung currency natin is bumaba masyado is wala nang silbi yung currency natin, like tulad sa ibang country is yung pera nila is million ang amount pero ang kaya lang bilhin nun is mga basic necessities. So ganun yung possible na iniwasan ng bawat country to avoid that problem. So next, business strategy. Maintaining strategies flexibility can take the form of dispersing production to different locations around the globe as a real hedge currency fluctuations. So, ang strategy nila is maintaining strategic flexibility to different location around the globe to hedge against currency fluctuation. So, ang gusto nila sabihin is naglagay sila ng mga tawag dito parang sa bawat location naglagay sila ng sabihin natin naglagay sila ng mga example natin franchise si Jollibee nag-franchise sila sa bawat lugar, then yung sale na makakuha natin doon is pupunta sa Pilipinas, and yung sale na yun is lalaki yung value or to promote yung sarili natin. And wait lang, ang gusto ko sabihin is kung mas maraming or mas na-spread out yung mga franchise sa bawat franchise sa atin is lalago ang country. So, corporate government relation. As major player in the international trade and investment environment, business can influence government policy toward the international monetary system. So, since malaki ang role ni corporate, si government is parang most likely nasusunod na i-influence nila si government para magkaroon ng relationship para sa monetary system. So, next. That concludes our part. Oh, wala na pala. Thank you.